Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our fourth event for the HTA in question. We started with looking at the quality of data in HTA, then we moved to regulation, then we looked at processes and methods. And today we will be talking about translating into practice, how HTA actually impacts clinical practice today. So we have our usual panel. Carol Longson via Artwin and Eric Lowe. Unfortunately, Dan Ollendorf cannot be with us today. I will be chairing today's events, and we have a special guest expert, Professor Peter Clark. Peter had a long engagement with NICE, and he was on the NICE committee between 2002 and 2009, and he was a chair of a NICE committee between 2009 and 2013, and he's a national clinical lead for cancer drugs at NHS England and for Cancer Drugs Fund. So a lot to learn from Peter today. And this is obviously probably the most important question we can discuss about HTA, because if it's making a difference, the only way we can see it is actually if it's making any changes at the level of consumption. For patients and for providers and for society. So in the ideal world, we may wish for a healthcare system to improve patient outcomes, to save resources, to improve systems efficiency, to improve access to healthcare and treatments, to promote innovations and bring them to patients. And this is a great list. It's very logical. Whether it's a universal health coverage system or it's a privatized system. But in the reality, these are very, very difficult to reach goals. And the different tools have been implemented across the world to try to achieve them. And one of them is health technology assessment, which has been practiced more thoroughly in Europe than in many other countries. However, Canada and Australia have been very, very proactive with health technology assessment. Developing world is looking into this and realizing this might be a very useful tool to try to improve on all these points listed here. But how it works is a big question, so we're here to discuss it. So the idea is that we can look at the innovation, at new products that come in with the help of health technology assessment, and see if they impact clinical practice. And hopefully in the process, we discontinue the use of outdated and inefficient technologies. So for today's session, we have a number of questions, but I just came up with these questions to set the scene. And let's see where we get to. I obviously challenge you to ask questions from our panelists, put them in the chat, or you can raise a hand and we'll spotlight you on the screen to give you an opportunity to engage in the discussion. So, but the first question for our panel is whether the translation of HTA decisions into practice been successful to date. What have been the implications for patients, clinicians, payers, and policymakers? The next set of questions looks at a role of HTA in the universal health coverage systems and how HTA improve effectiveness and efficiency of healthcare in settings with universal health coverage, and what can be done better. And a very interesting topic for discussion, I think, is whether HTA is helping with priority setting in different healthcare systems and whether it should be helping with priority settings. Maybe the situation actually the other way around. Maybe it's the politics and the priorities of the system that define what HTA activities need to take place in a particular country. So where the balance between these two perspectives lies, where we'll try to discover from our experts. So this is all from me. I'm now opening the floor to Professor Peter Clark to hear his position, and then we'll progress with the rest of our panel. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. What I do in life is I'm an oncologist by trade, and I shuttle between NICE, NHS England, clinicians, patient groups and pharmaceutical companies. And my job for NHS England is to get as many clinically and cost-effective drugs into play into clinical practice in England, and to make most of the £3 billion that we spend on cancer drugs. So I'll begin by saying there aren't many reasons these days to be proud of being an Englishman, given some of the pretty awful decisions that have been coming out of the UK of late. But there are some things that make me kind of happier in life as regards healthcare. First of all is the National Health Service. So as you've heard, it's a universal healthcare system, and it caters for 92% of the population, it being free at the point of delivery. So we have the NHS, we have NICE. NICE assesses the clinical and cost effectiveness for new drug indications, and it tries to do this in a manner that is as close to the date of a marketing authorization, i.e. it tries to be maximally relevant to the evidence base and opportunity. And NHS England, there's a legally protected mandate that the NHS has to fund all NICE recommendations. This is very, very powerful, because whether the NHS can afford it or not doesn't matter. It's got to pay for it for all new NICE recommendations. So the regulator looks after the first three hurdles of efficacy, safety, and quality. NICE looks after the fourth hurdle of cost effectiveness, but it's the fifth hurdle that really matters to patients and to clinical practice. And that's all about access to treatment. And as the topic is about, is translation into practice. So I speak from a cancer point of view, so I'm biased for a start. One would hope that clinicians involved in patients' care would know everything about the disease and about new treatments. And they would get this from their journals, from going to conferences, discussions with colleagues, even from talking to pharmaceutical company representatives. But we live in a very busy world of day-to-day clinical practice with ever more pressured time. And it's difficult for clinicians to keep up with things. In the last 5 years, there have been almost 220 NICE positive recommendations for cancer drugs. So how does the commissioner, the payer, try and ensure that clinicians know of the new availability of newly NICE recommended options? And we can talk about that in more detail, but in essence, it tries to land the information onto their desk and into their multidisciplinary teams for them to debate. Aha, NICE has said yes to drug X in disease Y in place Z in the treatment pathway. And the NHS is fortunate in the way it's structured, because all cancer drugs have essentially commissioned by the centre of the NHS. They have to be electronically prescribed, so that's handy. But the big way of keeping an eye on what's happening in clinical practice is that for the last 5 years, every new cancer drug indication requires a clinician to fill out a very quick form to signal to NHS England that they want drug X for disease Y in place Z in the treatment pathway, and their use is going to be in line with that NICE recommendation. So by filling out that form, we know exactly what's happening about treatment uptake in the NHS in cancer. And this is very powerful information, as you can imagine. So for most cancer drugs, we see the same pattern. So if the drug is regarded by clinicians and patients as making a clinically meaningful change to clinical outcomes in whatever disease, we see steady state use within 3 months of NICE saying yes. On the day NICE says yes, NHS England has to provide the funding, but within 3 months of that date, we see steady state use. And the key thing is that we see them at levels that are the ones we predicted from our knowledge of patient numbers and so on. But of course, and I suspect we'll talk about this later on, there are examples where uptake is slower. And whether that's new technology, new diagnostic, new support system, other impacts on healthcare, etc., we can talk in much greater detail if you're interested. And of course, there are certain technologies, e.g. the CAR-T therapies, where NHS England will take a very active role in managing the implementation, given the resource requirements that extend well beyond the chemotherapy clinic. So in summary, in England, we're fortunate because we have one connected access, the licensed regulator, the HTA body of NICE, and a healthcare system, which in terms of access to new drug indications is completely aligned with NICE. So health technology assessment has made a huge and vital impact to what the healthcare system delivers, because it's only delivering those drugs, those drug indications that NICE thinks is clinically and cost effective. And the one thing I'm sure of is that given the funding pressures that the NHS is under, but that applies to every healthcare system in the world, I am absolutely sure that as an oncologist, that without NICE present in practice, particularly in the last 5 years, when there's been this explosion of new cancer drugs coming through, the NHS would never have the access to cancer drugs that it currently enjoys. And of course, it would never be achieving the value for money that we get from those drug indications within the amount that we spend in England. So Lisa, I will shut up and let comment fly.
Thank you so much, Peter. Very powerful defense of HTA for England. Too bad we don't have Dan on the line to give the US perspective, where, of course, cancer drug situation is, there are a lot of cancer drugs there that are not available in England, of course, but the price tag is very high. So I'm inviting Vaya to maybe share the European perspective, whether you agree with Peter that across Europe it's a similar situation thanks to HTA.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Well, I can't speak on behalf of all Europe. But yes, I think, of course, the cancer drugs are, I think, also a particular type of drugs, I mean, type of interventions, right, that are highly regulated, but also highly carefully monitored in practice. And of course, we also have technologies that are not so well monitored in practice. So actually, we do not know the uptake of some of these technologies, and we also do not know the impacts of these uptakes, and also whether or not, if there is a new technology that flows into the system, whether or not the old technologies are still being used. And I think HTA can play a role in that respect as well. So it's not only about entry, it's also about, you know, trying to see where practice variation exists and where potentially disinvestment could take place. And I can give you an example of the Netherlands, where I'm based. We do not like to talk about disinvestment anymore. I think that's highly debated these days. We talk about appropriate care. So what our HTA agency does, in close collaboration with our NIHR, so we call that ZON NW, which is a healthcare funding organization of health research, is they work also with the medical societies to identify the areas where there potentially is practice variation. And then they review the current benefit package, what is offered, and also to identify areas that potentially could be, disinvested in. So I think that's a very important aspect which has not yet been fully explored within the HTA community. And we see more and more attention for this, but still I think HTA in all the years that we have been involved was mainly focusing on the entry of especially new, innovative, highly priced drugs, especially also drugs, and not so much about the efficiency of the healthcare system as such. Also, for example, in the Netherlands, I mean, HTA is only focusing on a tiny part of our healthcare budget because, I mean, it's only focusing on mainly on drugs and some medical devices, but the inefficiency in the system, which is mainly in long-term care, for example, or mental care, there has been not as much attention for those areas compared to drugs. And that's because of the regulation, and that the HTA system in the Netherlands is related. It's also set in law that every new drug has to be assessed through the HTA agency. And I think that's not the way to go. I think when we look at the questions that you said about priorities, I think we can have a huge debate on where we should focus with our HTA system. And I leave it here for now, because I also want to give the floor to the others.
Thank you. Carol, would you like to respond to Vaya's comment, especially about disinvestment, whether NICE was considering it and why not? And theoretically, we can apply HTA to many other things in the healthcare system, but we haven't and we can't for many reasons. What is your view on that?
So thanks, Lisa. There are so many aspects to this topic. I mean, every one of our sessions, there have been the topic has been multifaceted. This is definitely one of them. We've already got two aspects to explore. The first, I think, taken from Peter's commentary is, how do you build an end-to-end system, if I can put it that way, that works together to enable the introduction of new of useful and financially sustainable healthcare technologies into the system. So that's the first area. I'm going to touch a couple of comments on that, hopefully to generate a bit of debate. The second is that the only thing that HTA should be looking at in healthcare systems overall? That's obvious. My view is the obvious answer to that second question is no. The problem is we have so much flooding in that it's almost impossible to not keep your eye on that. And so I think the policy challenge or the dilemma that both HTA agencies and healthcare systems have is they have to keep a handle on those new things coming in. They're going to be there, but how do you then balance that with both identifying and then building systems that focus on other important priorities within the healthcare system? I don't think the HTA machine has really cracked that yet, and it would be really good to explore how we do that. But I'm going to come back to some of Peter's points, because he made so many rich comments and insights. It would be quite good to unpick them. The first is in the way that he described, in a sense, the interaction between NICE as a health technology assessment organisation and the machine that is the healthcare system overall, NHS England, and then clinicians. And my insight from that is just how important building that link is. For example, when NICE was first established, that realization was just not there. everybody thought, NICE is here now. It's going to issue some recommendations. They're going to pop out at the end, and suddenly the world's going to change. The healthcare system's going to change. And NICE we were 18 months, 2 years, 3 years into NICE pushing out evaluations, and nothing was happening at all. And it was at that time, again, as Peter introduced this link between having the financial flows available to actually be able to implement recommendations. It was at that point that government, it was the Prime Minister, the Health Minister said, we've got to give NICE some NICE recommendations some weight, and this concept of the funding direction came in force, which is basically an obligation on healthcare systems to find the resources, financial resources, in order to be able to implement that HTA recommendation. There aren't many jurisdictions that have that lever in place in such a fundamental way. But I would suggest, again, as Peter has indicated, that it's one of the most pivotal points of the translation of HTA into practice. There is no point having an HTA machine that's doing a lot of work and spending a lot of resources, both time and money, if you haven't got some docking station inside the healthcare system to be able to take them up. And the docking station is not just about clinicians and not just about patient pool, but it is about financial flow. So that's the first thing. The second, and again, something that Peter has highlighted, there is an information and intelligence system inside the NHS England healthcare system, which has the data available to be able to understand whether or not implementation is taking place. And again, that was something that wasn't there at the beginning, and it was actually, absolute credit to Peter and others who realized that in order to be able to effectively implement, you've got to have the information flows coming back. And possibly you have to have a few sticks in the system. So Peter's mentioned that clinicians have to fill out a form in order to be able to prescribe, which then sets out the information flow. And until you do that, you can't get access to the drug that NICE has recommended. But all of that works now as in a sense, a seamless and rather intelligent machine that is going from the HTA into the system, into clinicians' hands, and then back into analytics, into NHS England that demonstrate what's going on. So you can see how much effort it takes to translate HTA into practice. And we're only talking about cancer. And of course, cancer does have special and sometimes rather unique attention. Those learnings that we've talked, that Peter has highlighted, and we're talking about now in cancer, don't need to apply just to cancer, but you do need to have those types of infrastructures in place. And there is, I would suggest, provocative, there is no point having an HTA system unless a healthcare system is committed to doing something with its outputs, because otherwise you have literally a wasted and inefficient process. We'll come on to disinvestment, I'm sure, but it'd be really interesting to hear what Eric's got to say about that connected system and other things.
Thanks, Carol. I mean, I'm all for connected systems. So I think, like you, Carl, I mean, there's so many things, so many angles to come at this. It's almost impossible to do everything justice. So I'll try and sort of be succinct and just make a few points. So I think first point is that in a very chaotic world, HTA does, I think, generally a spectacular job. NICE specifically and HTA generally, I think, do a very good job in a very chaotic and imperfect system. Second thing is that we definitely need to move to a systems approach. We have to stop working in silos. We've got to figure out how to get the drivers, the incentives and rewards across the multiple stakeholders in the system much more aligned. we've got to create a demand side. So we've got to get better at signaling to suppliers what the health system needs, what patients need, what research questions need to be addressed, so that we get more of the things that we need. And I think the HTA, and I know HTA talks about life cycle management now. It's something that we've been talking about for, well, I've been talking about for 15, even 20 years, about this notion that HTA more or less sits equidistant from demand and supply and is better placed than any other stakeholder to look upstream to supply, to look downstream to demand, and to connect the two up much more than we're doing at the moment. So that's my sort of general points. I think what concerns me a little bit, and I apologize because I say this on every single call, is kind of rubbish in, rubbish out, is that if we talk about cancer, and I know the world doesn't revolve around cancer, is that we rely on regulatory data sets. And Peter will probably start rolling his eyes at me already. So regulatory trials are designed to answer regulatory questions, most often questions that the FDA are interested in and the US market are receptive to. They're not designed to answer questions that patients are interested in, that clinicians are interested in, that health systems are interested in, that payers are interested in. So almost no proper, pragmatic, clinically relevant and plausible research questions are answered in regulatory trials. And yet the £3 billion that Peter's talking about is spent commissioning what is essentially flawed data from a health system perspective, with some exceptions. So the challenge that HTA has in that sort of translation into practice is, how do we develop, or how do we move beyond what I would call consequential pathways? Because as Peter knows, and myeloma keeps him awake at night, it keeps me awake at night, there's just a torrent of stuff that comes at us, and somehow we got to figure out how to get it to patients. And what that means is we often have consequential pathways, which means that Peter and others have to find, shoehorn things into the system through the CDF, collect data here, patient access in here, managed access there. That's not a comparator, this is a comparator. So what you get is this consequential pathway in practice rather than state of the art. And the risk of that is that the health system, while it's managing its budget, it still buys costs more than it buys outcomes, because we're not optimizing the potential of the innovation, because it's not coming through in future-proof, clinically relevant ways. So I think what this next part of this translation to practice, we've got to figure out what the next step is beyond NICE, so that we can start to shape really intelligent, agile, thoughtful, responsive, more personalized clinical pathways that saves money but delivers more outcome and puts a little bit more agility in the system to reflect the heterogeneity of real world patients versus those that were entered into clinical trial 10 years prior to satisfy the needs of FDA. So again, I could say a whole lot more, but I'll stop there for now and give the floor to other people.
All right, thank you, Eric. I'll give a word to Vaya and then to Peter, but one comment before. So Pilar put a note about disinvestment, that it's happening in the developing world, logically, where countries know that they can make more by saving from what's less useful. Our fifth event will focus on the developing world, but I would like to hear from Peter if he sees in oncology whether disinvestment is working. And my second challenge, Lydia, I saw your comment, you will give you the floor as well, is from what Eric was talking about, to an extent, at least the way the system is designed at NICE, there is an attempt of having a dynamic system. We have a 3-year review where data supposedly could be generated in clinical practice, fed back, reviewed, decision can be changed or revoked. So how this dynamic works is, from my personal opinion, not very well, because very little is being generated in clinical practice, or it's generated too late because no one is doing those relevant trials. But with Cancer Drugs Fund, we pushed for it. So it's another push for this dynamic, so this to get the system breathing, so to speak, rather than being static decision implementation. So I'm giving you the word to respond to Eric with just the comments you've heard, and then to Peter to reflect on what you've heard so far.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines what you just said about dynamics, and I have a question actually for Peter, and maybe also for Carol and Eric, because I agree with Eric that we are focusing very much on a linear process, and we are not thinking very well about what do we want to achieve with whom and how and why. So I think this more agile or more dynamic process of what we want for a system, like what you're presenting, Lisa, on your first slide, one of your first slides, what do we want to achieve with our healthcare system? Not by, okay, this is a push from, I don't know, somewhere, we focus on cancer drugs, but what do we want to achieve? These questions. And that brings me back to the question to Eric, because I agree that HTA can be a kind of broker between the demand and the supply side, but we don't have the mandate to do this. So who is giving us the mandate to be the broker? Because we are pushed around, and we, I say we, the HTA community. So it is the system's approach, but if the system does not give the mandate or the responsibilities to those that could potentially act as a kind of broker, I think nothing will change.
Peter, would you like to come in?
There are quite a few things in the last few minutes. So it's very difficult because the politics of new drugs means that there's this whopping demand for the latest cancer drug, the latest multiple sclerosis drug, cystic fibrosis drug. So the points made about pathways, of course, and cancer is the most fantastic example of that, because of course drugs are now being licensed nearly always, not quite always, but on progression-free survival. So you don't know the effect on overall survival. And the problem with treatment pathways is that they're now getting so complex that you've got potentially third, fourth, sometimes even fifth line treatments. And if you wanted to do a really good job, of course, you'd want to look at the whole pathway. But all that's undermined by the fact that things are changing so quickly. So myeloma is one example. There'll be 2 new classes of myeloma drugs coming out. Both look very exciting this year. And of course, by the time you've evaluated their position at one place in the treatment pathway, they've jumped to the next, the license brackets political imperative has now moved that drug earlier on. So I think doing all this properly is incredibly difficult, particularly in a disease like cancer where things are changing so quickly. What makes it even more difficult, and I understand why NICE, I'm sure most people are familiar with the fact that NICE just about always these days adopts what's called the single technology appraisal process. So it is literally, oh look, drug X in disease Y in place Z in the treatment pathway is coming up for its license. We will appraise that in that spot in the treatment pathway and model like hell what happens afterwards. That of course doesn't lend itself to that more kind of holistic approach to saying, oh, look, we've got several drugs now coming in the third line space in myeloma, whatever it is. Let's appraise them all together. But of course, drugs aren't like buses when they all come along in threes. They come along in kind of in their own time scale. And of course, as soon as anyone, say, imagine NICE says, right, we're going to put all these three drugs together, so we're going to delay appraising it for a year. There's this outcry from dare I say, patient groups. Eric, you were chief executive of a patient group, weren't you? There'll be an outcry from Myeloma UK saying we want access quickly.
Not if I was there.
Just a tease, Eric. So it's very difficult, I think, to when drug discovery is happening so quickly, when the politics of healthcare is paramount, for this systems approach to work. And just I'll finish by saying, so for the last 5 years, NICE has had the option of when it's got key clinical uncertainties as to the effectiveness of cancer drugs to in effect temporarily say yes whilst two things happen. A, the clinical trial data matures. B, there is real world use. So there's now some really fascinating examples of real world use where, as expected, the outcomes are far less good in the real world than they are in the clinical trial. But there are some examples where the outcomes are matched in the real world in the clinical trial, generally because of reasons for selection. But what makes NICE's job even more difficult when they've got more mature data available and there's this real world evidence is that the treatment pathways have changed in the time it's been the Cancer Drugs Fund, because 2 or 3 new drugs have come in into the treatment pathway. So I'm afraid I can't offer a solution because NICE can't, is barely able to cope with all these new indications coming in. I don't think it's got the time. Carol can tell me whether it's got the inclination to do the really difficult whole pathway approach. But even if it does that, it's likely to be out of date by the time it's finished it. That's the problem. So I'm not offering any solutions to Carol or Eric. Only problems.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump. So all really good points, Peter, and I think that's why, for me, we need to be thinking about this conceptually to begin with. Is hypothetically, what would this sort of whole disease model pathway look like, and what elements of it could be implemented? And I guess I'm maybe too sort of optimistic about it, but my dream would be that over time, these pathways would become the norm. And that the system would change and supply would change in response to the demand that these pathways created. Because again, let's not keep talking about myeloma, but I think it's a good example of the craziness. Is one of the things when you take a whole pathway model is it tells you what you need. It tells you where your evidence gap is. It tells you what mechanism, what triplet, what you need. And it helps the system better make a value judgment in what's coming through the system. And we can signal, albeit just from one market, to supply, to say, look, guys, don't bring us another IMID, another PI, another whatever. Bring us this. And if you bring this and we slot it in here, you'll get paid sort of handsomely. So all of that sort of hypothetical, but these principles, if we could somehow start to put some of these principles into the real world, I think it would make a massive difference.
Thank you, Eric. So Carol, your reflections?
I'm just going to pick up on a couple of things, one from Eric and one from Peter. They're both sort of on the theme of can you bundle everything together and does it help when you do it? And my bottom line is no, it doesn't. From many, many years of experience of multiple technology appraisals, you'd think that would be a really good way. You've got 5 or 6 new drugs in a similar similar class, let's take a look at them all together and try to do one of two things. See if we can rank them in terms of clinical effectiveness, and see if we can, as a consequence of that, sequence them in terms of giving some steer to the clinical community about how to use them. The problem is it comes back to the evidence. There's never, and there really is never, the evidence to be able to do that thoroughly. So what NICE ends up doing is saying, well, they all look pretty similar in effectiveness. What it's all about is the money. So, you know, if you're thinking about it, choose the one with the lowest acquisition cost, or NHS England go and do a deal, perhaps, dare I say it heretically, even therapeutic tendering under those circumstances might be quite a useful budgetary mechanism. So you can see that the issues on how does an HTA organisation actually give an effective and useful steer to a healthcare system. As soon as you start to layer on the complexity of the system itself, you start to make it pretty obvious that a purist HTA approach probably isn't going to help particularly. And then it comes back to where we're all grounded in an HTA approach, and we're probably not spending too much time thinking, as Erica keeps pushing us to think completely differently about how to solve this problem. And I'll give you one example. It's not an example from the HTA world, it's actually an example from the regulatory world. Some of you in this discussion have been around when the EMA back a few years ago introduced this concept of adaptive pathways and adaptive licensing. Do you remember the lovely Hans-Georg Eichler had what I thought was a really creative idea from a regulator, which is not that we're going to lower our bar of evidence requirements, but we're going to build a regulatory system such that the evidence collection for what the real life therapeutic effect of a new drug is established post initial regulatory approval, but still being monitored by the regulator. So it's a little bit like what we've developed in terms of managed access, managed entry in HTA, but in a regulatory environment. And then as that data is collected, you refine the label according to the data that's being gathered. That concept went down like a lead balloon, both in the regulatory environment and I have to say the industrial environment, that it wasn't seen as sufficiently either robust or meaningful in terms of the magic moment of regulation for the community to be able to, you know, take it and start thinking about how you could do that. And it was, I think, a moment lost because we had a significant regulator thinking very, very differently about the way they regulate things. Now, that actually has translated post-Brexit actually into the MHRA thinking perhaps a little bit that way, so that we're still on, and I'm sure the EMA is also thinking about that, and we have the FDA, but nobody is thinking about it in a systems perspective, as Erica said. Everybody's thinking about it still, certainly from the regulatory perspective. They're back in their regulatory box, and I wonder whether or not there is either an ability or a willingness to actually tear up the entire sheet of paper that we've currently got and think about how you would design a system now with all of the knowledge we have in HTA, in regulation, in clinical practice, in patient perspectives, being able to frame all of that evidence that we collect and design something very, very different from the way that we've got it now. That still allows HTA people to do their job, still allows regulators to do their job, still has the healthcare system having to be engaged with implementation, but does it from a completely different place. Maybe that's what we need.
Yeah, so sorry to jump in, and maybe I'm sort of too negative about a lot of this stuff. But when I think about adaptive pathways, IDAP, ILAP, CDF, IFM, all that stuff, some people herald this as innovation and the great things since sliced bread and electricity. I see it as evidence of failure. Because we need this stuff because we're not doing the right research. We're not generating the right evidence. So we create all these fandangled acronyms to try and deal with it and address it. And to me, the message that gives suppliers is keep bringing this stuff and we'll come up with another acronym at some point. We'll bend and we'll flex and we'll find a way to get your inappropriate data to patients. Why don't we focus on, let's figure out what is the research question or questions that need to be addressed? How much of that can be achieved in a regulatory study versus a hybrid complementary or de-risking study that's run in parallel? So we start to generate the evidence at the right time for the right decision gate, for the right decision maker, rather than trying to say, keep bringing suboptimal stuff and we'll find a way at some point to get it to patients by buying off or addressing the uncertainty and the risk. It doesn't make any sense. And for those of you who listen to me, the Myeloma UK Clinical Trial Network back in the day, 2007 it was set up, was designed to address and de-risk the system by generating an NHS-facing trial to de-risk the regulatory study. And I think just something as simple as that, even just with a UK perspective, the NIHR and NCRI and all these clinical clinician-led study groups got their act together, did horizon scanning, engaged with the system and designed academic studies to de-risk pharmaceutical research. That in itself would make a massive difference.
I'm going to come in here because I want to join the topic of today's talk with what Eric has just said. In order for that to happen, healthcare systems absolutely have to be engaged in this in a really meaningful way. And when I say healthcare systems, I mean the everyday process of delivering healthcare, because unless you have that, so unless you have the practice element engaged, you won't be able to achieve the type of thinking that Eric is that Eric is putting forward. And I think that's another disconnect that we don't talk about very often. We do have, you know, in the UK, we do have NIHR, we have massive amount of research going on, but is it really joined up with what we're talking about?
Not at all. Not at all. There's no commissioning pathway. And Peter, sorry to be, there's no commissioning pathway for academic research. It's completely disconnected to commissioning. There's some exceptions and the stuff around the edges, but the vast majority of cancer trials that are funded in the UK make no contribution whatsoever to solving the problem we're discussing.
Vi, I'll give you a word in just 1 minute. I wanted to reroute some of these issues to Peter because you're the only one in this discussion who sees clinical practice. And what is your opinion in the sense whether there is willingness within the clinical system, within the actual in the place where things are happening rather than they're designed as in the nice offices, whether there's an appetite to for a change, and that, like Carol says, maybe we need to design a new system. And the more pragmatic step that Eric proposes, can we do these clinical trials, clinician-led trials to answer research questions, or not really because of willingness, capacity, funding? What is your perspective on these two big proposals, one from Carol, one from Eric?
So yes, I agree with Eric. It is disappointing that you know, the NHS, with all its expenditure, has all its budgets in the cliche of silos, and that it can't say, well, look, let's spend a little bit of our drug budget to see if we can make outcomes better, one thing, and then perhaps, of course, save some money at the same time. So I'm the first to say that. but the biggest thing for me though is, are there questions that are that big enough that can be addressed using the NHS, that clinicians, patients, whoever else can agree on, to say that is such an important issue for us to address now, without the danger of putting all that effort in and being the results being not being redundant but being less relevant in the years to come. So I need the kind of I need examples, if you like, from Eric to kind of to shake the kind of scales off my eyes, because the one thing about I spend my whole life dealing with clinicians is that they will agree on some things. Certainly they will agree more on kind of standard clinical practice, maybe, rather than what is the burning issue in this disease or that disease, in terms of a pragmatic trial of the kind that Eric has described. So yes, I agree the challenge is there to get the money to do it, because it should be there, and as Eric knows, in England the NHS has been talking to the NHR for a long time about doing this, having that separate funding stream, but I think that funding stream is there, but it's very modest. But clearly Eric's scale is a much more aggressive, a much bigger one. So it's does Eric think that there is sufficient clinical agreement in a wide variety of important diseases for such trials to actually be used and the NHS harnessed in that way? So back to you, Eric.
Yeah, it's a good point, Peter. Short answer is yes, I think there is. I aged dramatically trying to do it in myeloma. But just very one simple thing, because I know Via has been very patient. If you want to herd cats, move the food. And I think that clinicians will ultimately follow the incentive of where they get their research funding. They will do what they need to do to get the research funding. Right now, they get funded to do crazy things. If we change the incentive and we rewarded them and incentivized them to do proper, pragmatic trials that could be commissioned or contribute to de-risking our pharmaceutical data set for NICE, then I have no doubt that we would get them there. But it would be a challenge, but we could do it.
Thank you, Eric. So Via, what were your comments?
Well, I just wanted to react with an example, because we are of course focusing now on England, on the NHS. But like I said at the beginning, in the Netherlands we try to work. I mean, the Ministry of Health has a kind of coalition or agreement with our medical society. So with the I don't know how you call it in English, but with the association. So all the medical societies are in one association, and they have an agreement, because we have a zero growth budget line. So the hospitals cannot, we have a fixed budget in that sense. So, and they have an agreement between the Department of Health, Ministry of Health, the Association of Medical Societies, our HTA agency, who's also the payer, our NIHR, so ZonMW, for research. Patient organizations are involved as well, not industry. And they have agreed to come up with a kind of agenda for health research, HTA-related research, in order to optimize our healthcare system. And they together set the agenda. And that's what I try to bring across, is you have to think about what do you want to achieve jointly with all of the stakeholders together. And then you can decide or define the priorities. And of course, this is not perfect, but at least it's a kind of way of system thinking with all the important players around the table. And they link it also to the benefit package, because if, for example, something is not a priority, then you can also see whether or not you would like to invest in disinvestment studies as well to see, for example, appropriate care, practice variation, how can we optimize this? So it's all linked, and HTA is just a tiny part of that, because a lot of health research, health services research is related to that as well. So I think this system approach is not only about HTA, it's about also health systems research or health services research as well. Just to give you some inspiration that something is going on outside of the UK.
Excellent. That sounds very promising. And I very much agree with Carol that we have like 20 years of experience now that we learned from. We saw the mistakes, we saw what works, going back to the drawing board, not just in the UK, but many other countries that use HTA to see how we can now make things better would be great. The question is, who should be doing this? Would that be Department of Health, whose responsibility it is? And my other question for all panelists is, I think what for the example that Vaya gives is very important. I think each country should have this priority setting, and UK has it to an extent, but if we look at the concept of HTA, what Eric is saying, we're missing these trials. For example, we are missing many comparative trials in many fields. A lot of times the pharma will purposefully or pointfully not run these trials, and we can run them in the healthcare system to really set up league tables of what we can use or how we can price these drugs. We're still talking within the concept of a specific country making a decision. And when it comes to the trials that Eric proposes, or when it comes to the system, for example, that Vaya is describing, if it concerns very specific issues within Dutch healthcare, that's one view. But most of these questions are of interest to many countries, at least across the European continent. And it might be useful to the US, it might be useful to Canada, to Australia, to, let's say, developed world, where this particular, how can we join efforts? How can we ensure we don't make Italian healthcare system run that trial, NHS run another trial? These are huge resources. Plus, running such a trial might have problems with recruitment. Can we make them intercontinental, academic, and purposeful research? Or you see risks in this, or you think it won't work? How can this be funded? I mean, maybe talking about EU is easier, but not the UK. So just from the efficiency point of view, if we joined efforts, we could have addressed many more questions and use results. What happens, I think, especially with managed access agreements, data might be generated that Eric refers to through some of these managed access agreements, but it's kept secret, it's not being shared, and it's used only for the decision maker in that particular setting. However, the data that's generated, unless it's extremely specific for that population in that country, which in cancer I highly doubt, we don't benefit from this research. So what can we do from being a bit more collaborative?
So Lisa, I'm going to say just a brief thing then. I noticed Liddy's got her hand up. She has a question, but so I think these are all important points. And I think I'll make two quick points. One is patient advocacy needs to get its act together, because research doesn't happen without patients. And right now, patients are going into research studies that aren't even ethical, because it's not about how future patients benefit from the results of research. Half of academic research isn't even published. Most academic research doesn't change clinical practice. So patient advocacy needs to stop banging on the door of NICE and HTA bodies saying you're the bad guy, and actually focus in on academic and commercial research and start to get these guys to up their game, be more collaborative, be more efficient, be more pragmatic, and answer the questions that are important to downstream decision makers. Because these trials are happening all of the time. We spend gazillions in investigator-initiated studies. In the UK, the Association of Medical Research charity members spend about £1.5 billion a year on research. Very little of that shows up in a NICE submission. So it's being done anyway, and I would argue we need actually less research, less money spent on it, and actually let's focus on quality and the right research to get done. And I think patients need to figure out how they can start to advocate within government, within industry, within academia, to ask for this change.
Thank you. So Lydia, we'd like to hear your question.
Well, thank you, Lisa. And actually, it's a question and a comment, and I realize we're running out of time, so I try to be brief. But my understanding from outside is that NICE is fully focused on cost effectiveness. While I think it's very important, and that's what Europe is trying to do now, that we decouple the question about added therapeutic value from the cost effectiveness. That is exactly what now is happening in Europe with UNETA 21, where the clinical benefit will be evaluated at the European level, but the cost effectiveness will remain at the national level. And I think this is really two different questions, and I think it's a good thing that it's decoupled, because that brings me to Eric's comment that I fully agree with, is that today, what NICE is also doing is only looking at the regulatory data set, means regulatory endpoints. And this is not what patients want to see, what HTAs wants to see. I think we can all agree, and we've learned from Ian Tannock also, in cancer. Of course, this is typical for cancer. We want to see data on overall survival and on quality of life. And as a patient representative in the CAT with EMA, I can tell you that quality of life is really not discussed even with the regulator. They only talk about safety, which is for me different from quality of life. But okay, this is a side remark. So let's stick to the whole idea that now at least Immer Cook also has the intention that, as was said, that the clinical trials, the registration clinical trial should also answer the research question for the downstream stakeholders, being HTA and patients. So what is a possible solution? It's a dream maybe, but people are starting to think along these lines, is that scientific advice should have input from HTA, so that the clinical trials that are designed for regulatory questions should also answer at the same time, and not in a later stage, the questions from the HTA. That is one way of thinking. But then, of course, scientific advice has to become mandatory. And most importantly, the big difference with the system in the US, that today EMA cannot approve the registration trials. It's not in the legal system today. And that's really a major difference with the FDA system, I think. So there we need change, and maybe it can happen with the pharmaceutical legislation that will be revised. So let's hope that we get some changes there. And I also want to make a comment on what has been said about life cycle management and the endpoints that today in cancer, it's even not progression-free survival. I've looked at the approvals from last year, and almost half of them are even on response rate, which is not really a very solid endpoint. So why don't we think about more conditional approvals and then follow up and see if the real endpoints are met later on, and then have a reassessment once there are more data available. I know it's all theoretically and it's difficult to implement, but at least I think this could be a way of going forward and really bringing those products with added therapeutic value for patients in the system. Yeah, I'll stop here. I can continue for another 15 minutes, but that's not the purpose, I assume.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Reflections on Lydia's points. Carol, maybe you'd like to take the floor?
So Lydia, you make some really important points and a few observations about NICE's processes and methods. Just for clarity, there is absolutely no cost effectiveness assessment without having first established relative incremental benefits. So whilst NICE does it sort of all in one, it has to go through the sequence of knowing how much better this new drug works compared to what's in established practice. It's just the way that NICE processes work. You don't see that distinction between relative incremental benefit and value for money as two separate steps. It's all combined in one thing, but they absolutely have to do it. And that's one of the problems it gets into, because as you said, what everyone sees at the moment is the registration study. That's all that's available when many HTA organisations have to do their job, and particularly when NICE has to do its job alongside that regulatory review, because it wants to provide an access signal as close to a drug being on the market as possible. So that's all there is, and that's what the issue is. How do we design a process that either allows us to robustly and quickly and efficiently collect data on the final endpoints, overall survival, health-related quality of life, earlier than we do now? I think that moment has passed, because the regulators aren't going to go back to their previous way of thinking, of not allowing these surrogates to come through and being used for the actual registration approval. So how do we design a system that allows drugs to be used once a regulator has made a judgment? We can't deny that that's their job, and that's what that's what they're there to do. But allows us to both monitor the performance of the new drug in real life, and do that in a way that feeds back efficiently and effectively into an HTA process in real time. That's what we've attempted to do in the Cancer Drugs Fund. That's the point of it. Is it working sufficiently well enough? I'm going to ask Peter to give his view on are we actually achieving what we set out to do, and how do we engineer a whole system that allows us to work with the regulators and with patients and with clinicians, so that we do what Eric said, which is collect the data we know we need and not the data we don't need, in order to inform two things: better decisions downstream, and definitely better discussions about value for money downstream. So Peter, I don't know what you think about the performance of the Cancer Drug Fund, but it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts.
So in the last 5 years, there have been about 50 odd drug indications going to the Cancer Drug Fund. And just to emphasize that a drug goes in when the NICE committee has a plausible ISA on the table at the time that it appraises the drug, and but has key clinical uncertainties that would hopefully be addressed with the passage of time. And as I said, not frequently that is waiting for the relevant registration phase 3 trial to mature, generally because there's uncertainty about the overall survival estimates. But as Lydia has mentioned, there are significant numbers of drugs coming through that are showing great promise, certainly in terms of response rates, and being licensed on pretty small single-arm studies. And the great majority of those drugs that have come to NICE in the last 5 years have ended up in the Cancer Drug Fund. So more than 50 have gone in. just over 20 have come out. All but one has ended up has gone into what we call routine commissioning, i.e. NICE has delivered a final yes. I'm not sure that many of the clinical uncertainties were indeed answered by the time in the Cancer Drug Fund. To a certain extent, they may have been when you had 3-year, 4-year overall survival data. But I think those indications that had been licensed on small single-arm studies, those have been greatly helped by real-world evidence, because the might of a single healthcare system with 55 million people in it means that you can get a lot of data quite quickly. And the data we collect is, I'm the first to say, is relatively crude. So is this a clinical trial data set? Absolutely not. But we're getting data retrieval of 98, 99% for treatment duration and overall survival, and for certainly those indications that have left or come back to NICE for reappraisal that have been licensed on small phase 2 data sets. The great numbers that the NHS has been able to deliver has allowed two things. One thing is the company the confidence to model the clinical benefits on the real world data set. And that's a real triumph, because we all know that the real world is often a very different place to the clinical trial population, but also has allowed those drugs to be considered to be cost effectiveness. What I'm not allowed to tell you is, of course, is what price they came at originally, what price they went into in the Cancer Drug Fund, and of course what price they went into routine commissioning. But all I will say is that was I alarmed at the final decision for every single one of those in terms of the price consequences? The answer is no, I wasn't. So I think what's been learnt is that you can get good data, you can resolve some uncertainties. It's often the comparator uncertainties that aren't resolved, of course, by the Cancer Drug Fund use. Of course, patients have had temporary access, but, you know, and this is where I pay tribute to the pharmaceutical companies. You know, they have recognized the power of a single market and of the importance of getting their drug into play, into routine commissioning, so it's there for as long as, of course, it isn't supplanted by someone else. And of course, they have priced their drugs accordingly. So it's been a success for patients, it's been a success for NICE, it's been a success for NHS England. And whilst pharma will moan and groan, I think most of them will regard it as being a success, and that's measured by the fact that of the first 20 that have come out, only one of them has actually failed to make it from the Cancer Drug Fund into a permanent place. So is this a model that we think works? The answer is yes. I'm the first to say I'm biased because I've had a lot to do with how it works. But in a healthcare system and in a country that isn't awash with cash, the NHS has, of course, gone beyond cancer drugs to produce a fund now that is going to be for all cancer, for non-cancer drugs, because it sees the model as having worked. And as I said, you know, there are, just coming back to real world outcomes for a minute, NICE committees have been struck by what they see. In some situations, a very big difference between clinical trials and the real world outcomes, which I don't think is a surprise, but have they taken that into their consideration of clinical and cost effectiveness? So the answer is, of course they have, because they want to make the best decisions possible and the best set of data. But of course, primarily they want to remain relevant to clinical practice. But they have been struck too by those indications where, for a number of reasons, where clinical trial outcomes have certainly been matched by those achieved in the NHS. So is it a model that NHS England is happy with? I think the answer is yes. Is it a model with NICE happy with? The answer is yes. Is it a model that pharma is happy with? And I think this is the interesting question, because on the one hand, they get their drug into play in clinical practice, and we know that getting your drug into play first is so important when there are so many drugs from the same class all potentially getting licensed. But I think I would imagine there'll be some caution with some pharmaceutical companies in disease pathways that are changing very quickly. Because if it's changing very quickly, it's possible by the time you've got some data mature or new data from real world evidence, the clinical pathway may have changed and your drug may be rather less relevant than you thought 2 or 3 years before. So so in short, Carol, I think it works for most people and most stakeholders at present.
Thank you, Peter. We have a challenging question in the chat, whether you think the real world evidence data collection can resolve the disinvestment issues. So any comments on this?
I would hope so. I'll jump in. I would hope so, because as I think you mentioned, Elisa, there is a built-in NICE review process timetable, so that routinely, for every indication that NICE says yes to, correct me if I'm wrong, Carol, but every 3 years, NICE asks the question, should we have a look at this again? And particularly for that, if adaptive licensing does ever see the light of day in any meaningful way, of course, that would be the perfect time to look at it, both from the regulatory point of view, let alone from the HTA assessment point of view. My worry about all this is that the investment in molecular research, cancer or non-cancer, is now paying huge dividends in an ever bewildering variety of new mechanisms of action for drugs and new drugs, new combinations of drugs. So my worry is whether NICE actually would ever be able to have the capacity to cope with all those the new drugs, because they can't ignore them for a variety of reasons, the pathway issues, let alone reviews of the basic question: did the drug actually deliver what it said on the packet?
Thank you, Peter. I'd like Carol to respond, though, and maybe Eric and Vaya from your perspectives. But in the chat, Francois raised an interesting point in terms of incentives. What kinds of incentives a pharmaceutical company has, and what kind of incentives the healthcare system would have. And for example, the healthcare system may say, we are very interested in disinvesting just to make sure we don't use obsolete technologies or save money. But even if they have that incentive, do they have resources? Do they have capacity? So how do you see incentives playing in here to act on that?
I'll answer Francois's point in a minute, but just on disinvestment. Firstly, we probably need an entire seminar on disinvestment, as we can see, because we've hogged the show with the introduction of new technologies into clinical practice. But a couple of things on disinvestment, and again, just from my perspective of NICE over the years, spent quite a bit of attention on disinvestment. Never quite cracked it, if I can put it. Never quite achieve the goals perhaps and the aspirations of others, but that wasn't because necessarily it didn't explore things very thoroughly, but two things kept coming back. It was almost a sort of a loop. It actually is very, very difficult to identify a technology where wholesale it's of no use. It's usually about finding the best place to use a technology, which is also usually far less, perhaps, than is currently being done. And so over the years, NICE turned the phrase disinvestment into optimization. And I think you've also had a similar experience in the Netherlands. It's about finding the best place for the use of a technology in the main. There are some there have been some over the years. NICE had 2 or 3 goes programs, disinvestment programs, and all of it came back to clinicians not really being able to either agree on what topics would be useful to look at for disinvestment, because they all had their views on which particular patient might be useful to apply this technology to. And then when you start to look at the evidence, you usually do find some effect somewhere. So it's a really interesting topic. And I think, again, as HTA organisations, there's probably a lot that we can explore from the perspective of different HTA organisations on the disinvestment topic. So maybe, Lisa, that's one for you to think about for the future. To Francois's point about there's no incentive for companies, I'm reading it now, to use clinical endpoints in their development versus surrogates. That probably is the case now, because we have a regulatory system that is I wouldn't say embracing, but certainly accepting the use of intermediate and surrogate endpoints as proxy for benefits. We are where we are with that. What we've done, I think, with something like a conditional approval in the HTA sense, and especially in a jurisdiction that looks at both clinical and cost effectiveness, is that you can use the uncertainty that's generated through the use of non-final endpoints and use that in a discussion about price. And I think that's quite a useful mechanism for turning what is sometimes a very negative thing, which is not having the real endpoints of interest, into something that's actually useful for a healthcare system that always struggles with financial sustainability. So I see it as a little bit more half full than you might do, Francois.
Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes left, and I think the comment that Peter made in the beginning is praising the fact that we have HTA, and that it actually, at least within NHS, enabled access to very important drugs for the patients in England and Wales. I very much agree with the point that if we imagine the world without HTA, there would be a lot of questions about lobbying, corruption, pricing, who made these decisions. At least we can show the paper and say, that's why we did it. And then, of course, all the issues can come up, whether the data was what we wanted it to be. But at least we have a very transparent process and justified decisions. And I think the value of that for translation into practice has been tremendous. But then we spent an hour and a half discussing how actually HTA has so much to go, whether it's HTA, in order to actually have in the practice the goals that the society would like to resolve, that the system would like to achieve. And we seem to be somewhat far away from HTA actually fulfilling all these needs. So I invite the 4 of you to give maybe 1 minute a summary of where do you think we're now in terms of, do you think we've done a good job to date? And just a brief sentence, one wish you would like to make to improve things. So Eric, let's start with you.
Could you tell I was desperate? So short answer is that I think HTA generally has done a great job in a very difficult, chaotic world. And my hope is that Peter made a very compelling case for CDF. I would contest, though, that we need to move that concept earlier into running that de-risking, that real-world evidence generation in parallel to the regulatory study. It is not that difficult to predict what the uncertainties are going to be based on a regulatory trial design. So the things that come up at appraisal that lead to the need for the CDF, you can pick them up much, much earlier on. And that's where the opportunity is to actually generate that real world evidence, as Liddy and others have said, in parallel, in hybrid, in a complementary way to the regulatory study. And from that point onwards, everything becomes hopefully slightly easier. And the incentive for pharma is that the price they're going to get from NHS England in that process is going to be a whole lot higher than the price they're going to get in a CDF when they're trying to get this real world evidence that's quite crude to change and address the uncertainties. That's their incentive. So that's my hope.
Thank you, Eric. Violet, your final words?
Well, I agree with what Eric just said. But in addition to that, I also think that that HTA is great. I mean, where would we be without HTA? But I rather like to focus not only on the influx of new technologies. I rather would like HTA to focus more on the sustainability of healthcare systems. And I think there's a lot to gain there as well. And of course, it all depends on the resources that will become available for HTA. But I think maybe we could even have more efficient systems if we focus less on the influx and more on what we already have and how to optimize the current systems, involving, of course, all stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol?
Yes, well, I think I'm with Eric as well. I think he's just expressed it so well. We owe a lot to HTA. I personally owe a tremendous amount to HTA. It's been most of my working life, and it's been both fascinating and rewarding. But I do feel that in order to achieve what Eric has described, we probably do need to tear up a few current regulatory and HTA processes and clinical development processes and start with a slightly cleaner sheet of paper than we were anticipating now.
Thank you, Carol. So Peter, final word to you.
The bonus of having the payer as part of directly involved in the HTA process cannot be underestimated for all sorts of reasons, because it allows the HTA process and the payers' views to meet around the same table. It is incredibly important. And I think that's been one of the great bonuses of what's happened, particularly in cancer drugs in the last few years in England. And the second thing is, this whole topic was about translation into practice. If you don't collect the data as to what's happening, you don't know. So we're fortunate in cancer in England, whereby we do have systems where we do know how many people start treatment, and we do have information systems that allow us to collect, albeit crude, but important data as to actually what happens in the real world. And those two things, I think, are terribly important if you're going to ever know the answer to what happens to HTA guidance once it leaves NICE, leaves whatever body in an email attachment. What matters is what happens on the ground.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you to all our experts for this excellent discussion. Very thought-provoking as always.